evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lissa Frankel. I'm the president and CEO of the Charleston Gilead Center, and we are delighted to be hosting this evening and the whole week of really collaborations and workshops and residency here with STEP Africa, with the International African American Museum. And so excited for y'all to see the work tonight and to take part in this conversation. Thank you for bearing with us as we accommodate this very new sort of space for a talk. It's actually what looks like it's working okay, but it was due to an overwhelming interest in this subject, and we hope folks will keep trickling in. But our other space that we usually use for things like this was just too small, so we're expanding for a good reason. With that in mind, as you can tell, this is the performance hall lobby. So after the performance, if everyone could please remember to exit quickly out of the doors, please grab a drink at the bar, which will be outside. You can talk about what we've discussed tonight. And then the ticket takers will scan your tickets and let you back in to come and join us for the show. Okay, so without further ado, let me I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's panelists. So I'm going to start with this wonderful woman here on my right. Felice Ferguson Knight is a native of Charleston. Many of you probably know her. She was recently appointed the Director of Education at the International African American Museum, which is really a perfect position for her as she's pursued telling the untold stories of marginalized and ethnically diverse and understudied communities throughout her career. So she's done that at a number of universities, a number of institutes, which include the past co-director of Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at the Citadel, and the former chair of the History and Culture Subcommittee for the City of Charleston Special Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Reconciliation. So we're delighted she's going to be our moderator tonight and tell us a little bit more about the history of the Stono Rebellion. Second, I have with me C. Brian Williams, who is the founder and executive director of STEP Africa. C. Brian Williams first learned about the tradition of STEP at Howard University, where he was a member of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. I noticed that all of your dancers identify their fraternities and sororities at the end of the show, which is perfect. He founded STEP Africa in 1994 and has since performed, lectured, and taught in over 60 countries, as well as extensively throughout the United States. And through Williams' leadership, stepping has evolved into one of America's newest cultural exports, and inspired the designation of STEP Africa as Washington, D.C.'s official cultural ambassador, which is pretty cool. He is the recipient of numerous arts fellowships and awards, too many to list, but he also produced the drum folk production that we're going to see tonight that explores the untold story of South Carolina's history of the Stono Rebellion, or Freedom Movement, as we've been referring to it. We have the privilege of seeing this work for the first time in Charleston tonight, only 20 to 25 miles from where the Stono Rebellion took place. And it is the last time the company will present this work, so it is an important night for everybody involved. Finally, last but not least, we have Toby Smith at the end of the aisle here. Toby was born in Charleston, but grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She doesn't like me saying this, but she began her professional career in the CIA, which I'm so impressed about. She worked at the Charlton County School District as a public relations officer and organized the first effort to create a bond campaign to repair dilapidated schools. She's been involved in multiple ways in politics, including being the first African-American woman to run for mayor in 2015. And in 2018, ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in District 1 as well. She's been a radio broadcaster and a minister. And in 2020, Toby joined the interpretive staff at McLeod Plantation, which is one of only 2 places in the country that intentionally examines the issue of slavery from the viewpoint of the enslaved. So we're very proud to have her here and interpreted that for us here in Charleston. In November 2021, Toby was promoted to the position of the Cultural History Interpretation Coordinator for Charleston County Park and Recreation Commission. And in that capacity, she assisted in the planning of the International Conference on the Stono Rebellion. So we have a lot of very smart people up here, and I'm going to turn it over to them now. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is truly my honor and pleasure to be here with all of you this evening and with these very distinguished guests. So, without further ado, we're going to get into our discussion for the evening. I was asked to just provide a little bit of the historical background on the freedom movement known as the Stono Rebellion before we get started. And I've worked really hard on this introduction to try to keep it short and sweet, but you're looking at a professional historian, and professional historians are not known for being succinct. So we're going to sort of break this down into the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how, but not in that order, because I never do anything in order. So first of all, let's just talk about the what. Let's clarify the terms. This was not a rebellion. It was a freedom movement, a legitimate and historic, heroic attempt by captive Africans to free themselves from illegitimate bondage. So, for the rest of this discussion, I'm going to refer to it as the Stono Freedom Movement rather than the Stono Rebellion. But it's okay to say either, because the technical term, if you look it up in history books, it's going to say Stono Rebellion. So the when. This freedom movement began on September 9th, 1739, and the where, just 25 miles away from here along the Stono River. And it lasted by some accounts for several weeks, and even one of the leaders of the movement held out for his freedom for at least 3 months. So who was involved in this freedom movement? More than 600 enslaved Africans, the leaders of whom, according to historian John Thornton, were likely from the Kingdom of Congo, one of the largest kingdoms in West Central Africa with advanced social, economic, and political systems, and it also had one of the largest and most advanced militaries in that region for the 17th century and 18th centuries. According to Thornton, soldiers from Congo were trained in indigenous and European-style warfare. They knew how to use indigenous and European-style weaponry, including guns. In fact, that region of West Central Africa had been trading for Europeans for at least 3 centuries before the Stono Freedom Movement occurred. So these were not novices who were involved in this freedom movement. They were trained, they understood what they were doing, and they had an objective. They wanted to make it where? To Florida, which in 1739 was under the control in terms of the colonization of the Spanish. And because of the geopolitical machinations of Western Europe and the colonial enterprises overseas, Europe and, of course, England were constantly at war. Spain and England were constantly at war. And so the Spanish king, in an effort to try to destabilize the British colonies that were really just taking root, of course, the earliest one having been Virginia in the 1600s, but Georgia had just been established, right? 1732. So around this time, the Spanish king, trying to destabilize these British colonies, offered freedom to any enslaved African who made it from the British colonies to the Spanish colonies in the South, Florida. That's where they were headed. So that's the context, you know, the who, the what, the why, the where, the how, and with this being one of the largest freedom movements in British colonial history, some of us may be wondering why we haven't heard of this before. And that's kind of where I want to start this conversation, Brian and Toby. I would love for each of you to share with this audience how you first learned about the Stono Freedom Movement, and then add to that, how has that knowledge shaped your work professionally?
Good evening, everybody. I grew up knowing about Stono. And when we came back to Charleston in 1977, I started doing a little bit of digging. But fast forward to 2017, I was at a conference in Boulder, Colorado, where I was privileged to meet Dr. Peter Wood. Some of you may know Dr. Wood. He wrote the seminal work, The Black Majority, and in it, he proposed some amazing analysis about the Stono, thought to be one of the first times that it was presented in such a manner. And having had access to him opened up a lot of things for me. And we have since become great friends, and also learning about Dr. Thornton. So that's one piece of the story. The second piece is, I work at Charleston County Parks and Rec. We have a sister property called Caw Caw. And Caw Caw is actually one of the sites where parts of the rebellion occurred. I'm happy to see one of my colleagues here tonight, Julie Glass, who is there every day. So we get to tell the story of what happened. There were actually 6 places where the battle took place that day. It continued, but at Caw Caw, we tell the specific pieces of the story, so the history marries itself to the present and to nature each and every day, and the more we know, the more remarkable the story becomes.
See, this is why you hang out with historians, because they are able to bring so much life to what you're about to see on stage. And for me and for Step Africa, our introduction to the Stoner Rebellion was through a gentleman by the name of Dr. David Pleasant. He's an artist who was actually living in Brooklyn when we met him, but he's from Savannah, Sea Islands, part of this Gullah Geechee tradition. And he is the one, at the time, I was really curious about the art form of stepping and where it came from. I was, fraternities and sororities created stepping, percussive dance form, but many of us who practice the forms didn't really know why we started stepping in the first place. So that was the question: why do we step? Why do we use the body as a drum? Why is the drum so absent in traditional African-American music and culture in terms of dance styles in particular? So that Dr. Pleasant told us about the drum folk, these people led by Bessie Jones at the time, who used the body as a drum, and he introduced us to the Stono freedom movement and the subsequent Negro Act of 1740, which really becomes the basis of the work today. And for us, it was foundational because for many years, if you had asked someone in a fraternity or sorority where stepping comes from, they would kind of generically say, from the continent of Africa. They wouldn't say what part of Africa, which cultural group, which tradition. It was kind of a generic understanding. But what the Stono tells us is that it really is rooted in African experience here in the Americas. So when the drum is taken away from African people after the rebellion and in 1740 in that Negro Act, then you start to see this whole transformation of the culture where the drum is absent, but it reappears in some really fascinating ways. And you'll see some of that on stage today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just to piggyback on what you said, I realized I left out, the key part, right? So after the freedom movement is essentially stopped, the South Carolina colonial legislature does pass this law, the Negro Act of 1740, which further restricted the already restricted lives of enslaved Africans in the colony. And many of the restrictions included restrictions on communication. So for example, during the Stono Freedom Movement, the colonial observers noted the use of the drum, both as a part of what they thought was a dance that took place in an open field, but it was really preparation for war. These Congolese soldiers were trained in a martial arts form that looked like dance, perhaps related to modern day capoeira that is practiced in Brazil. And so they were utilizing the drums, of course, to keep the rhythm as they prepared themselves, and then also to communicate with the enslaved on the nearby plantations. And so one of the aspects of the law was to ban the use of the drum in the South Carolina colonies by the enslaved, and many other bans as well. And so absolutely, it's a critical moment, right? These were freedom fighters, and they some were, as Toby has shared with us at an activity we got to do the other day, where we went down to Kaka and several other sites. Some were successful in making it to Florida, but most were not. Unfortunately, the result for many of these people who participated in this freedom movement was death. They were executed, and their heads were decapitated, and their heads were placed on pikes, lining what is now Highway 17. So this is, a movement that should be talked about, and that kind of brings me to the next thing that I'd like to talk about with the two of you, Brian and Toby, is just to sort of talk about the ways in which both your knowledge of this particular historic event and also Black history and culture has shaped the ways in which you practice your professions, and how have you been able to use this knowledge through your professions to share Black history and culture in unique, transformative, and creative ways?
Sure. Well, you'll see the major reason, or the major way it has informed Step Africa tonight on stage. I mean, a lot of our work is about bringing forth histories that just haven't been dealt with. And we've taken this work all across the country, and we found that 95 to 97% of the population just have never heard of it. And so for us, the theater can be not just a space for entertainment or reflection, but also education. And so it's great to use the stage as a way to introduce parts of our history that unfortunately we weren't able to learn. And I think for the artists who perform the work, it's been transformative as well. Coming here, visiting Kaka, going to the banks of the Stono River, and living with this work for over 5 years now. It's very sad for me to see it end, but if it must end, I think this is the right place in terms of the people here who live with this history in a very different way. And also for all Americans, when I think of Stono, I think of the men and women who were fighting for freedom as almost like some of the first examples of American activism, because they were fighting for their freedom prior to the Boston Tea Party. Just 20 years later, the Boston Tea Party would happen, and then everything would change. But these African activists, if you will, kind of set the stage for later activism in the country.
I'm very fortunate to be in a place that allows us to talk about history. No one comes out to me at any point and says, you really need to stop saying what you're saying. In fact, in April, 95 countries of the world came to visit McLeod Plantation alone. You have to ask yourself why. And it's because we are talking about these untold stories openly, candidly, through tears, through anger, through pain. That has to happen. And I'm not sure that we've ever really let ourselves touch the grief. And that is what we do in these sacred places. Going to Kaka was emotional. There were a lot of tears, but it was okay. The ground can absorb this, and I think it's time, and I think that's part of the reason the Charleston County Parks did what they did. So every day people come to us, as I candidly say, I get to talk about us all day long, and that makes me feel good. And we're teaching the next generation. There are no holds barred. And I do understand that that's not the case all throughout this country. So I'm grateful. I'm also grateful that we help teachers, because we can say things that teachers can't. And that's very, very important. So the conversation is real, it's needed, it's timely, and it's available. And if you all haven't been to either one, get a gold pass. I hope to see you before this year is over.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. Thinking about the Kaka experience, I would love for each of you to sort of share with our audience what we went through. So I think it was Tuesday, right? We boarded a school bus. It's the first time I've been on a school bus in I don't know how many years. And we had one exceptional rule follower Miss Sterling, who buckled her seatbelt. Good job, Sterling. The rest of us just rode carefree with the windows down. But yeah, and we visited sites that were connected to this freedom movement. Toby, could you share with the audience where we went? And then Brian, I'd like for you to follow up with maybe just your personal reflections on that experience. I'll share mine too if we have time. And how maybe that experience might have shaped tonight's performance in maybe a different way because of the way that, you know, the entire team experienced those places. So just a rundown of where we went.
We started at Stono, on the banks of the Stono Lakes, and we went to the water, because our story starts at the water. And then we left the Stono, and we went to the historic marker at the Sea Island Cooperative. Some of you know that story was purchased by the late Mr. Curtis Inhabitant, a wonderful servant legislator in this town. We didn't go to Bulow Landing, which was just behind there, but from there we went to Caw, which was spot number 4. And then the remaining spots were on Ponds Road, where the folks actually almost captured Governor Bull. And then from there, we were going to go to Willtown, and we would have seen actually the Edisto. So we touched the first 2 places. And actually, that was more than enough. Actually, the first 3.
No, I mean, I'll tell you, it was great to actually be in the place. It did feel very special, sacred, trying to envision those spaces and seeing in Caw the remains of the rice fields and what it might have looked like, and trying to just imagine those spaces 400 years ago, maybe 300 years ago, I guess. What I was very happy with is that I feel that Step Africa really understood this story, and so the trip was almost reaffirming, and I felt that the work we have created does honor those men and women in really exciting ways. And that shows that the history can be learned and can be shared and absorbed, even without going to space. And by going to the space, so it centers it. So I do think for this evening's performance, it'll be interesting to me to see how the people respond, how you respond. And I think, I'll just give you some hints now. It's very interactive. I would encourage you to be connected with the artists from the very moment they step on stage. And there's a chant. I'm going to give you a hint, because sometimes you come to these things for inside information. They're going to do a chant, and they're going to say they took the drums away. And they're going to ask you to be a part of that, because the drums were taken away here in 1740. And they'll ask you to respond to that. And I hope that you will respond enthusiastically, and let's turn this entire space into a drum together.
Wow, that's fantastic. I really love that. I think I will offer a few reflections on my experience. As you heard in my bio, I'm a native Charlestonian. I'm excited to see so many of my family members in the audience this evening. And so for me, on my mother's side, we are the Gaillards from Salagree on James Island. And I have done some basic research into our family history and have at least found in the Freedmen's Bureau records immediately after the Civil War that several of our descendants were sick and in a Freedmen's Bureau hospital on Johns Island. And then they had to report to the Freedmen's Bureau what their status was before the war. They reported that they were previously enslaved and named a plantation, which I believe they named was the Oaks, where they were enslaved. And so I did a little bit more research, and I know the Oaks plantation was on Johns Island. So when we went to Caw, and then to add more to that story, the primary crop that enslaved Africans were forced to cultivate here in the Carolina Lowcountry was rice. So not cotton, but rice. There were some who cultivated Sea Island cotton, which was a unique kind of cotton that has silky fibers. It's not sticky and short like the staple cotton that you learn about from other places, and it fetched a very high price on the market. But this rice, so I imagine, I'm not sure, but I imagine that our enslaved ancestors were forced to cultivate rice, much like what we saw in Kaka. And all I can tell you is that when I was walking through those rice fields, I became so full of emotion. I felt just, the lumps rising in my throat, my eyes filled with tears, because I'll let Toby explain it a bit more, but the engineering involved in creating those rice fields, the intelligence that was exploited, broke my heart, but also made me so proud of what they did. And then I had to think, what if we had been paid for what we did? Where would my family be today? I almost did not want to think about that. But it is really fascinating, I think. And I think this is a great, segue into the performance we're going to see tonight. When you can make some type of emotional and spiritual connection to whatever it is that you are experiencing, it makes that thing have such a deeper meaning and impact upon you. And that's what happened for me, out there in the fields. And I hope that something like that happens for you tonight. I'm actually confident that it will. A little more of a sneak peek, and then I'll let Toby talk a little bit about the rice fields. I haven't seen this show, but we were very fortunate at the International African American Museum to have 2 members of Step Africa, as well as Brian, come out and offer a masterclass to the community. Anyone who was at the museum yesterday, was it yesterday? Yep. Yesterday. And then as well as we invited 2 high school step teams. The coach of one of those teams is in the audience. Ms. Brittany Gaillard, who teaches at Lucy Beckham in Mount Pleasant. They brought their step team. And then also Burke High School had their step team as well. And so the young people performed, and then we had the master class. And when I went up there to participate in the master class, it was electric. I'm not, too much of a dancer. I love to dance, but I'm not, necessarily skilled at it. But the way in which they taught us was so affirming. We formed a community step group that day. And all I remember is my assignment was to give the countdown to start the stepping. 5, 6, 7, 8. And I shouted it. It was so much fun. So I think you're going to feel some of that, you will feel that electricity tonight. They're fantastic.
If you all come and visit, we'll walk the grounds of Kaka. It's about 654 acres. We're not walking all that. We will walk from the Welcome Center pretty much in a circle. We'll go see the Cypress Tupelo swamps, which had to be cleared by hand, which often took a year. And then we'll see the embankments that were made so that the rice fields could be flooded. And then some of those dikes are still there, and we'll stop and reflect on the work that these folks did. The fact that these pieces are there and you can touch them makes this just a remarkable, it reminds us that we are walking with history all the time. So please consider a visit, bring the kids. There are places to have reunions. Come and visit. We'll also explore Laurel Hill, which was the area that the enslaved lived and called home, and there's a cemetery there as well. So there's a lot to see there.
Well, I really don't want to bring this to an end, but we are out of time, and they do have to clear the room to make way for all of you to come back in and see this fantastic show. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you, and enjoy the show.